that through this conversation, I will be coming on at the end of this to thank everyone. But I want to say once more, thank you. Thank you to all who registered and joined today. Claude.
Thank you so much, Kumba, for the introduction. It is a great honor to host Michaela Wrong on this inaugural event for Notes from Africa, and looking forward to more Notes from Africa, and just salute Africans Rising. Also, I want to thank the rest of our sponsors, including not only Africans Rising, but Advocacy Network for Africa, which, you mentioned Africans Rising is over 800 organizations on the continent of Africa. ADNA is US-based and it's over 200 organizations. We also have Friends of the Congo as one of our sponsors. AGLAN, African Great Lakes Action Network, which is also the organization that I belong to, and HMG Network. So just wanted to thank everybody that is a sponsor of this event and this great conversation that I'm looking forward to. Before we start, I just want to give a little bit of background on what's Rwanda. Most people hear it, they've probably heard it from the film Hotel Rwanda, and they probably think it's Zamunda or Wakanda, or something like that. But Rwanda is actually is a real country. It's not just a movie. Hotel Rwanda. It's a really small country in Central East Africa. To find it on a map, you got to look for the Congo and Tanzania. It's a very small country, very highly populated, and it's a country that's well known for the gruesome genocide that took place in 1994, which the film Hotel Rwanda is also about, with with a history of violent regimes running the country. And today, Rwanda has another extremely violent regime. In fact, a regime that 8 months ago kidnapped Paul Rusesabagina, who is the real life hero of the film Hotel Rwanda, took him to Rwanda, and now he's charged with terrorism. The story of Paul Rusesabagina is not that unique in terms of the kidnapping and the abduction. They abducted him from Dubai. This is very commonplace abroad, where people are found in other countries and either taken to Rwanda or assassinated. It's also very common inside of Rwanda. People come up missing all the time. In fact, right now, one of the most prominent person that's gone missing for the last almost 3 months now is a poet by the name of Bahati Musa. He's known for his very, very talented artistic work, which, some of it is critical of how people are treated in general, education in the country, and things like that. And he's gone missing. He's not the only artist that has gone missing. The beautiful song that we started this with, which is Igisobanuro cy'urupfu, meaning its translation is the meaning of death, by Kizito Mihigo. Kizito Mihigo was also assassinated last year, in February of last year, by the Rwandan regime after falsely accusing him of planning terrorist attacks. So same as Rusesabagina and others who are usually charged with the same charge, then made to forced to confess, tortured, confessed under torture, then imprisoned for 4 years, then pardoned after 4 years in prison, and then after about 1.5 years out of prison, they arrested him, they detained him for 4 days, and within those 4 days, he came up, he was dead. And the regime claimed that he committed suicide, but of course, this is a person that had been in prison for 4 years, never committed suicide, was out of prison for 1.5 years, never committed suicide, and all of a sudden, he is in a cell for 4 days, and he commits suicide. But we know that the regime has a lot of tricks. This is not something that Africans know, and I think it's really important. Let no African kid ourselves that Paul Kagame is what he is pumped up to be in terms of a Pan-Africanist or even a progressive president. He is a very repressive leader, Paul Kagame, and the RPF, which is the party that he leads, has committed massive atrocities, but we'll get into that conversation shortly. So now, before I invite Michaela Wrong to start the conversation, I just wanted to share a little bit about who she is. She's a writer and a journalist with more than 20 years of experience of covering Africa. She joined Reuters news agency in the early 80s and was posted as a foreign correspondent to Italy, France, and Ivory Coast. She became a freelance journalist in 1994, where she moved to then Zaire and found herself covering both the genocide in Rwanda and the final days of dictator Mobutu Sese Seko for the BBC and Reuters. She later moved to Kenya, where she spent 4 years covering East, West, and Central Africa for the Financial Times. She is the author of 3 books of nonfiction and a novel. She's regularly interviewed by BBC, Al Jazeera, Reuters, and other news outlets on her areas of expertise. She's published opinion pieces and book reviews in various publications, very highly esteemed, and travel pieces for Condé Nast's Traveler magazine. And the book that we're talking about today, among her many books, is Do Not Disturb, an African Regime Gone Bad. And today, Michaela, Do Not Disturb, the story of a political murder and an African regime gone bad. And Michaela, I would like to welcome you to this conversation. And as we start this conversation, which is going to be interactive, I would like for you to share, understood that you were a freelance journalist. How did you actually end up freelancing in Central Africa, in Zaire and Rwanda? How did those end up being your choices, or how did you end up there?
That's a good question. Firstly, let me say thank you very much to everyone, the various organizations you've already mentioned for inviting me on this panel. I really appreciate the chance to reach out and talk about my book with a network that I don't usually have contact with. Yes, I started off as a journalist and then I became a writer. And actually, it's not something I bothered to go into in the book, but I ended up in Kinshasa as a stringer for Reuters and the BBC because I had been working for a British newspaper and it didn't work out. We had very different viewpoints. I realized they didn't like the way I worked. I wasn't very happy with them and I found myself out of a job. And I had already done some work in Africa and Ivory Coast. And I thought it was just this very short taste of Africa. And I thought, well, I need work. And so I called up Reuters and said, do you need anyone in Africa? And they said, we need someone desperately in Kinshasa. So I went there. I'd never been there before. And it was a very steep learning curve. And within a couple of months of my arrival there, I was sent there partly because I was Francophone. Within a couple of months of my arrival there, the genocide began in neighboring Rwanda. And I think it's very easy to forget now how little was known about Rwanda to many of the journalists and much of the world at that stage, because now we've seen so many articles, so many books, so many academic studies. And at the time, I remember that I hadn't expected to cover Rwanda. It wasn't part of my patch. I'd photocopied a few stories about the peace talks taking place between the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the rebel movement led by Paul Kagame, and the government of Juvenal Habyarimana that were taking place in Arusha. I understood nothing about what was going on, and that was all I knew. And then suddenly the killing started, and the killing went on and on and on, and no one seemed to be able to explain what was going on. And so I was sent to cover the French intervention, military intervention into that area because I spoke French, and then suddenly was beginning to understand that this was not sort of random, chaotic anarchy. This was a very well organized, it was a genocide that was being organized by the Hutu extremists in Terhamwe and by the government of Juvenal Habyarimana as the Rwandan Patriotic Front came into Kigali. So it was a steep learning curve. And I think, one of the things I try to confront honestly in my book is that, like many people, many journalists, many analysts, many diplomats, my perception of the RPF at that time was very much dictated by what we were seeing, which were these sort of piles of bodies everywhere, hastily buried, massacre sites. It was so obvious where the killing had taken place. Talking to Rwandan, church people who kept lists and lists and lists of the victims. And so here was this rebel movement coming in. And as they came in, it ended, and there was this mass exodus of Hutu refugees, and the government of Juvenal Habyarimana into Zaire, and the killing ended, and therefore there was this sense of, oh my God, thank God it's over. And I think because there was this relief that the violence was over for a long time, and then there was this transitional government put in, which was Hutu and Tutsi. It was multi-ethnic. It was saying all the right things. It was bent on reconstruction development. It clearly needed a lot of help. That there was
Michaela, real quick for the audience, for those who may not know what Hutus and Tutsis are, these are ethnic groups in Rwanda.
Yes, ethnic groups, also social, political kind of divisions between Rwandans, the Hutu majority, and President Habyarimana was a Hutu, and the Tutsi minority, which had been very much intimidated and repressed and sort of pushed into exile under Habyarimana's rule. So just to say that there was a sense of we have to rally behind, the international community has to rally behind this former rebel movement as it took power, help them. They're saying the right things. They've stopped the killing. And I think, looking back, there are a lot of things about that narrative that turned out to be untrue. There are a lot of details, and a lot of atrocities had been committed during that rebel advance into the country, and a lot of atrocities and war crimes would go on to be committed by the RPF as it supported the AFDL rebel movement into neighboring Zaire. So, but there was definitely that immense goodwill in the international community towards the RPF. And that, I think that has lasted up until now. And one of the points I make in the book is a lot of that goodwill, which sometimes seems out of kilter with what is actually going on in Rwanda, is the product of guilt. Because the West, the UN pulled out its troops as the killing started, and they weren't there to stop it. They didn't do much. They saved the Western expatriates. The French were busy sort of evacuating the people who'd committed the genocide to safety instead of saving the victims. So there's a huge sense of guilt, and I think as a result of that, there's been this tendency to give the RPF a rather soft ride.
I do want to add, in addition to what you said about the French mission, there are thousands of people who were actually sheltered in those French-controlled zones who were able to escape the violence and then returned to the country after things settled. There is a number of areas that I want to touch on in the book. And I want to start with, because you just talked about it, I didn't have it in this order, but you just talked about it. Most people, when they hear about about Kagame and the RPF, the movement, it seems like it was just like a movement that fell out of heaven and came and stopped the genocide. But you just talked about atrocities that they committed coming up, through their rebellion in areas that they occupied, systematically killing people, where we have 1 million refugees inside of the country, internally displaced, who were fleeing all of this violence. And that's a part of, I read the book, I read the advanced copy in January. So some of this information may be in the book, but I noticed that I've seen this in your articles, like the Kizito article that you wrote in February, I think, and it was published in the
Observer.
In the Observer. So if anybody hasn't seen it, please check that article out in the Observer. You talk about those atrocities, and I think in a way they kind of tie to the main characters in the book. You know, Patrick Karegeya and Kayumba Nyamwasa, and the whole story in the book, which will get to the essence, you know, the assassination and, you know, the extrajudicial killings. But talk a little bit more, just so that our audience can be educated about, you know, some of those atrocities. What did you find out later from this movement that looked like they brought peace to the country and they had fooled everybody? And I know in your book it starts with the advance copy, that Rwandans lie. Of course, I do think that a lot of the characters in the book do lie. They did lie a lot, and you discover that. So what did you discover about those atrocities? I want to bring the ordinary Rwandans into the conversation in terms of what happened to them, the peasants, and then get into the high ranking officials that are mostly in the book.
Well, yes. I mean, I don't go into huge detail in that period because I think other writers have delved into that very thoroughly. You know, you've had Judy Reaver writing in Praise of Blood, which is her sort of controversial account of precisely that period. And I didn't want in my book to sort of rework material that other people were publishing. But I think that, you know, a lot of that evidence has been presented in front of the ICTR, the International Court Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in Arusha, even if it hasn't had an outcome and hasn't led to prosecutions or trials. So there is a lot of evidence that, you know, during that advance by the RPF on Kigali, crimes were being committed, ethnic cleansing was taking place, and there were pogroms that got almost no coverage because journalists were not active in that area.
That's why I'm asking about it, because a lot of it has not really been in the public.
Yeah, and it's still being contested, fiercely contested, you know, by the government in Kigali. I think one of the problems was that was an area where journalists would go with the RPF minding them. And therefore they saw, you know, their minders, their translators. They needed, often they needed transport, they needed translators who spoke Kinyarwanda. So they saw what they were allowed to see. I think for the series of events I focus on more because it's very much less controversially been recorded is what happened quite soon after after Kigali fell into RPF hands. And you had Robert Gersony, a US expert, who was sent to find out, you know, whether it was safe for all the Hutu civilians who had fled into Zaire to return once the war was over in July. He said, you know, his findings were pretty devastating, and they were kept secret, but are now available for anyone to read. The UN didn't want to widely circulate them because they really do log. He talks about up to 35,000 people being killed by the RPF in ethnic cleansing and a general sort of drive to get people, to remove people from certain parts of Rwanda. And the other piece of documentation I found very compelling was the book written by Robert Kruger, the US ambassador to Burundi, who was seeing flooding, you know, Hutu civilians flooding into neighboring Burundi, who were fleeing what was taking place in Rwanda, and it was killing by the RPF. So, you know, I think there's very compelling evidence, and we haven't even started to talk about what happened in the forests of Congo in the late 90s, once there was that AFDL rebel movement, which ended up toppling Mobutu, which was supported by the Rwandan, the army, the RPF. So I think a lot of this stuff was known at the time, but nobody put it all together. Now there's more of a tendency of the sort of, we can form a picture that's more coherent.
Yeah, I thank you for covering that, because I did want to start with those pieces, like the pieces that not as much covered in so many other places. You did mention In Praise of Blood by Judy River, which, you know, covers those. And you just covered basically the pre-genocide, the post-genocide violence, the Robert Gersony report that showed, you know, thousands of people were being massacred inside of the country. There is the Kibeho massacre that took place.
Yes, I didn't even mention Kibeho. Yes, yeah.
And then there was all the killings in the Congo that the UN mapping report documented and said that if taken to court, this could be basically that the RPF may have committed genocide, or the government, the Rwandan soldiers in the Congo may have committed genocide in the Congo. I also was one of the people that fled into the Congo. And when I fled from Rwanda, we were being bombed. The RPF was bombing indiscriminately everybody, and we all just rushed out of the country. And even once we got into the Congo, they were still bombing us. And so those are stories untold, and I wanted to cover those, and then get into the main topic of your book. There's two things that I want to cover. You can pick which one to start with. One is the political assassinations by the government of Rwanda. And the other is I want to spend more time on the international community's attitude, even today. So either of those subjects, if you would, let's talk about those, and then.
Yeah, I mean, the political assassination is sort of the main focus of my book, because it starts with the murder in South Africa of Patrick Karegeya, who was the former head of external intelligence in Rwanda, who ends up being strangled in a hotel room in the Michelangelo in Johannesburg. By and this was by agents who'd been sent by Rwanda, so sent by his former boss, President Paul Kagame, and he had fallen out with Kagame 7 years earlier, had fled to South Africa, set up an opposition party, and knew that his life was in danger, but had decided to do away with his the police guard that he was provided with by the South African government. So it was a very shocking event, because this man had been incredibly influential and incredibly close to Kagame. And the question then becomes, you know, this is a different face of Rwanda from the one we've been used to presenting, because I think up until these very high-profile assassination attempts started being made, because he was by no means the only one targeted, that there was a sense of, here was this RPF, the ruling RPF, Paul Kagame. It was a government that had been set up by Tutsis who were living in Uganda. They were protecting the beleaguered Tutsi minority that had survived the genocide miraculously, and that in the forests of Congo there remained, you know, members of the FDLR, the Hutu extremists who were still bent on finishing the genocide, finishing the unfinished task. And that certainly was a narrative that was presented by Paul Kagame's government and accepted, I think, by Western diplomats who have heavily funded and aided the government in Kigali. But the puzzling thing about Patrick Karegeya's death, and also the many assassination attempts that have been made on General Kayumba Nyamwasa, who had also set up this opposition party with him, is that these were very high-ranking members of the Tutsi elite. General Kayumba Nyamwasa was the former head of the armed forces, and a Tutsi from Uganda who spoke English, who'd known Kagame since his youth. Patrick Karegeya had been to school with Kagame. They'd all been founding early members of the Rwandan Patriotic Front when it was forming secretly inside Uganda, inside the heart of the national resistance movement of Yoweri Museveni. So these are insiders, high-profile insiders, and that's not the same story that we had been hearing up until recently. And I think, you know, that's something that people who write about Rwanda and don't go into the minutiae can often forget, that it's not, it's not a sort of black and white scenario anymore. It's not that Hutu extremists living abroad are denouncing Kagame as a dictator who rigs elections and stifles all free speech. There are many people who have been at the highest levels of the Tutsi elite, his closest comrades, who have shared everything with him. And they're the ones who are saying, this man is a dictator, this man has no respect for human rights, this man does not tolerate dissent, this man is rigging the elections. So I think, that's a different scenario from what many people seem to assume is going on in Rwanda. Yes, Karegeya murder and the attempts on General Kayumba. What I discovered writing the book, researching it, was that these were just examples of a very, very wide program being run by the government in Kinshasa, usually carried out on the ground by the Rwandan embassies or high commissions to reach out. Yeah,
Michaela, you just stated Kinshasa or Kigali?
Sorry. I meant Kigali. So, Kigali is controlling the high commissions, the embassies, and they are finding out where all the members of the diaspora are located. Anyone who stands up and criticizes, who writes an article, who runs a blog, who has ever even been seen on Twitter to say something critical of the government, and it will work out where they live, collect information on them, harass them, intimidate them, beat them up, and if they're really high profile, it will try and take them out, as it did with Patrick Karegeya. And I found that whole scenario,
that is still happening today, by the way.
Absolutely. It's been happening since my book came out. There was a killing of Saif Bamporiki, RNC official in Cape Town, in a township there just a couple of months ago. It is still happening. The tracking is still going on. The intimidation is still going on. So
the
that
surveillance of people abroad, the infiltration and the monitoring and all of that. That's something that the regime continues to do in many ways. In fact, I do want to bring this story forward before we shift a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, the government of Rwanda kidnapped Paul Rusesabagina about 8 months ago. Just last week, I believe it was last week, I believe it was the second assistant to the ambassador of Rwanda to the US was caught sneaking into a Zoom classroom where Paul Rusesabagina's son is a student at St. Mary's College, if I recall correctly, the name of the school. So this is happening today, like as we speak. In fact, for those of you who are following on HMG network, and if you've been following some of the conversations we've had all kinds of intrusions. They don't only do it physically, and now there's a lot of cyber intrusions and cyber attacks. And this is something that we've seen, and it's continuous. So the monitoring doesn't just stop there. It goes into violence. As you know, the story is a political murder, and the political murder is of somebody that actually worked with them extensively. Even like the crimes that we talked about, he was a part of those crimes. He was part of the Congo desk, where they were plundering the resources from Congo and invading the Congo and creating all kinds of chaos in the Congo. And Patrick Karegeya was the head of the Congo desk. Kayumba Nyamwasa was the person who led the counterinsurgency in northern Rwanda in 96 and 97, which you talked about at the very beginning. And yet, Kagame pursues them and wants to kill them. Yet the government of Rwanda pursues them and wants to kill them. So for a long time, the people who criticized the government of Rwanda were labeled as Hutu extremists or conspiracy theorists. I actually saw a ridiculous New York Times review book, article that kind of, still says things like that. And I'm like, is this person living in the 21st century? So let's get into the 21st century. What is the international community thinking, sponsoring still today and supporting a brutal dictator like Paul Kagame? And what is the reason from what you've researched?
I think this is not my first book. This is the fifth, and I've become more and more critical about Western interaction with Africa with every book, I think. What you see in every country, and Rwanda is no exception, is that there is a kind of lethargy. There's a momentum that develops in relations between Western governments and African allies. And once a certain relationship is established, people are extremely reluctant to change the relationship or to voice criticism. I mean, we just saw a very interesting article about how the American embassy decided to accept the obviously rigged results in DRC. A fascinating study. I recommend it. It's on of course, my foreign policy, I think. I think what you see in Rwanda is you see a government that has ticked all the right boxes on the development front. In terms, there are certain things that please donors, and they are things like mosquito net distribution, primary school attendance levels, maternal mortality, the state of the roads, whether or not you're rolling out vaccinations in the COVID era or vaccinations, to your cattle in normal times, agricultural policies, whether or not they feel that a government is a government that listens, that has technocrats that are on the case and giving them the statistics they want. And Rwanda has always been superb at doing this. And I think it has created the sense of being the perfect development partner in Africa, and a sort of model that all the donors hope other African countries will follow. In fact, when you scratch below the surface, you discover that a lot of these incredibly impressive statistics that are sort of constantly repeated by donors, they don't stand up particularly well to scrutiny in recent years. The performance is not quite as brilliant as is made out. There is a certain amount of tweaking and fudging and altering of the key statistics. But I think, the donor community is desperate for success stories in Africa. It looks across, all these donor darlings. There was Ethiopia, which has now exploded into civil war. There's Uganda, where we saw incredibly violent elections. These were poster boys for the donors. And then there's Rwanda, which has this sort of harsh, but Kagame's rule is saying, yes, he's a hard taskmaster, but by God he gets things done. And the West likes that, and they particularly like the fact that he's very tough on them, and he will constantly lecture them on not interfering and on letting him run the country the way he wants to. I think there's a kind of sadomasochistic drive there. They like to be given a lesson and a lecture at regular intervals. So all this works in Rwanda's favor.
But none of those Western supporters would actually let their children live in a place ruled by somebody like Kagame and the RPF. And it does not make sense. In fact, he also has a lot of fans, a lot of, I call them trolls, Kagame supporting trolls in the Western, not only in the media, but in academia, in business, in, so many places, of course. We know the big names, the Tony Blairs, the Bill Clintons, and the Paul Farmers. But there's also like an army of trolls that pretty much go up against anything that that shines a light on the atrocities that that the government of Rwanda commits. We saw recently that they actually get paid. A lot of them get paid. There was an Al Jazeera interview. Again, for some reason, it keeps bringing me back to the Paul Rusesabagina story. He happens to be the most famous Rwandan, I think, where the Minister of Justice admitted to the government of Rwanda paying for the flight that kidnapped Paul Rusesabagina from Dubai to Rwanda. And I keep wondering, as a journalist and with your colleagues, how can more of these stories make it into the public so that the public know that their taxes, because you are from a donor nation, you are British, I'm an American citizen, it's a donor nation to Rwanda. And as a Rwandan, to me, it's like when I pay taxes and it goes to a regime like that, it's like basically sponsoring my own, the murder of my own people. But as a journalist, how do more of these type of stories get out so that, you know, the
yes, I mean, the other
knows.
thing you didn't mention about that, the Justice Minister at the same time as talking about the plane and spending all that money kidnapping Paul Rusesabagina, it emerged that he was taking coaching sessions from a London-based Western lobbying firm. And those firms are extremely expensive. And we know that the Rwandan government spends a lot of money on lobbying firms in Washington and in the UK to present its case to sort of, you know, this very glossy, impressive, clean, squeaky clean image to the world. It doesn't come cheap. And I think there are major question marks about that. I think there are major question marks as well about the deal that the Rwandans signed with the Arsenal Football Club, which, you know, very expensive deal, presents Rwanda as a marvelous place to go on holiday, cost the Rwandan government an awful lot of money. And you sort of think this is one of the poorest countries in the world. I think it's the 12th poorest country in the world. Why is it spending its money on advertising, giving money to an extremely rich football club in the West? And I think, you know, this is a country, a government that's obsessed with its image. And so it thinks that's a worthwhile way of spending money. And, you know, many of us would would not share that view. But they certainly dedicate a huge amount of time and money to it.
So back to your book, and back in the theme of notes from Africa, what would be the biggest takeaway for anybody, both on the continent, in terms of the new information or what they would learn that is, you know, previously unseen, and people in the West, you know,
I think what I hope is that people will sort of regard that story as being more complex than they have up till now. I mean, I think at the beginning of the introduction, you presented you know, there is this facade, there is this whole Rwanda story that the world has accepted and embraced. And if I speak to people who aren't experts on Africa, they'll always say to me, "Oh, Rwanda, that's a great success story, isn't it?" And you kind of go, you know, I would share what you just said, which is it's a success story, but I personally wouldn't want to live there. It's a success story where if you vote in an election, your vote is irrelevant. It's a success story where every single newspaper just kind of is a tide of sycophancy towards Paul Kagame. It's a success story where people disappear just like that and they are never seen again and you never know what's happened to them. Is that a success story? I mean, yes, people, you know, people's living standards might have gone up and they may be getting vaccinations, but is that what we regard as a developmental success story? I personally don't think so. And I just hope that people who read the book or who bother to read about Rwanda will just think it's more complicated than we thought. And after all, any country that has had effectively the same leader for the last 27 years, because Paul Kagame has really been running the country since 1994. I mean, I don't know any country in the West where that is the case. That has to be the biggest warning signal of them all, that this is not what any of us would regard as an accountable democracy. So I would just hope that you know, my book is intended as a corrective. It's not the last word. Plenty of other people will write other books, you know, and many people will be disagreeing with my book. But I just think that people should be aware that it's not quite as simple as they may have assumed up till now.
Yeah, so let's bring in the audience, please. For those of you following via Zoom on webinar, please go ahead and send your questions. And also, if you're following on YouTube or Facebook, please go ahead and send your questions. And you just touched on something that one of the participants asked, participant by the name of Manti McMurchie, asking, what type of pushback do you anticipate from the Rwandan government, as this book is not kind to the president of Rwanda in outing the president as a gangster?
Well, I mean, I've already seen the pushback. So, you know, there are favorite propagandists, spokespeople in Rwanda who have large followers on Twitter, and they one of them's published a 20-page diatribe against me in the book on his blog, and there are newspapers that are pretty much mouthpieces, newspapers and magazines in Uganda and Rwanda that are really mouthpieces for the government in Kigali, and they've done the same. And then on Twitter, it's sort of 20 abusive tweets every half an hour. You talked earlier about the army of trolls, and I look at these tweets with amazement, because there is no insult and no allegation really that hasn't been made about me. It's always very personal, because people don't want to engage with the arguments you make. They just like to hurl abuses at you as a person. And I sort of end up thinking, I gather that a lot of these Twitter accounts are run by Rwandan intelligence. And there'll be one man sitting in an office who's got 5 or 6 accounts, and he's just pumping out rubbish and smears. And you sort of think, are you aware of what image of Rwanda you're actually conveying with all these smears and allegations? Because what emerges to me is this is a thuggish regime which will stoop to any tactics to smear its opponents. This is not an impressive, it's not what I would call a good look for donors. So I would encourage donors to go onto Twitter and do @MichaelaWrong, and just see the kind of stuff that's being said routinely from accounts that are, they have apparently 37 followers, 54 followers. So they're not genuine accounts. They're fake accounts run by intelligence, and just sort of think, oh, okay, so this is how this government deals with anything approaching critical challenge, and this is our partner, our aid partner.
So it's a good thing that you keep hitting on the international community, because I think it's important that the world understands this, and that most people get to understand this. One of the things that you said in the book was that you were cautious about the questions you asked Patrick Karegeya, or I guess you were lenient because he was down on his luck. If you were to go back to that time, would you still be lenient, or would you push hard to get even more answers?
Yeah, well, you're
what
quite
questions
right.
would you ask?
Yeah, no, you're quite right, Claude. The point is that I never thought I would write a book about Rwanda, and I certainly never thought I would write a book about Patrick. Patrick was someone who I had, got to know as a journalist, because he was the man who dealt with the press. Then I'd sort of seen him after he'd fled into exile, and had several long lunches with him. And yeah, he was down on his luck. Rwanda wasn't a book, it wasn't a story I was writing about. I was involved in Eritrea and Kenya. And I never thought I was going to write a book. So when he was telling me things in his later years that were the opposite of what he had said when he represented the government in his prime, I just kind of, I rarely took him up on it, because I just sort of thought, okay, that's really interesting, but I'm not going to be writing about this, and left it at that. Had I known that I was going to end up writing a book, then obviously I would have pressed a lot harder. But this is the nature of the beast. I've ended up writing 2 books, because I also wrote about John Githongo, the corruption whistleblower in Kenya, where they're about people that I knew, but when I first met them, I had absolutely no idea that they were going to become books. So you have a different approach. When you sit down to interview somebody, it's not the same as when you sit down and have lunch with someone who's become more or less a friend over the years. And but of course, I regret it now massively. Yes.
Yeah, and so for the people on the continent, who many of them actually see, Paul Kagame as a big time, progressive, looks out for Africa and for Africans, and they haven't seen these stories. What would be the biggest or most important takeaway in terms of from reading this book, it opened my eyes to, I understand, the story is more complicated, which is true. I actually agree. The black and white story of the genocide is it's not right. The black and white story of the RPF being good guys, who were victims in exile, which they were, who came and became saviors against this brutal dictatorship, is also not true. Black and white. There's no good and bad, or good or bad guys, but there is a lesson. There's something, to be shared. And I think, maybe we can use the example of, and maybe for those who are aspiring to go into positions of power, especially, we can use the example of what happens to the various characters in the book, where they start changing their story, but because they ran propaganda for so long, no one seems to believe them.
Yes, I mean, that's the issue I confront at the beginning of the book, which is that if you've been telling a narrative for a certain number of years and then you change the narrative, a lot of people will not believe you. And as a journalist, that's the challenge. Do you believe them, or how do you work out when they're telling the truth or when they're not? I think I mean, one of the things I find alarming is when I see that, Kigali, which is a favorite conference center, hosting these big get-togethers. We've got the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting will be there in June. And, what you often hear, you see African ministers, government ministers going to Kigali and coming away and saying, that place is great. It's so clean, it's so neat, everything's well ordered, everything's working, the donors love it. We should be like that. And you kind of think they're picking up the wrong message. You can be effective and roll out vaccines and provide decent primary school care and tick all those donor boxes. You don't have to be repressive and rig the elections and snuff out any protests and chase all your journalists into exile. To do that, it's not, that's not the deal. And I think that's the real danger with Rwanda and Paul Kagame, that the deal becomes, if you want to perform, and this is something the donors tend to fall into, this idea that only authoritarian leaders can deliver development, effective development, and democracy is messy, chaotic, and it doesn't deliver. And I think if you go to Kigali, if these leaders go to Kigali and come away with that message, that's such a damaging thing to conclude. And I think it will blow up in their faces, because what really worries me about Rwanda is the sustainability of that model. Kagame is no longer a young man. There have always been rumors circulating about his health. If you've been in position for 27 years and you've systematically, got rid of all your nearest rivals and they've all fled into exile because they realized they were all going to be killed, well, who's going to take over? So what happens when he goes, and how will he go? So it's such a bad model to follow. And I just think it's so dangerous that this has now become allied to this idea of development, performance. People need more than just vaccinations and primary school education.
There is a couple of, there's a comment here from Monty McMurtry again that says, in writing, they're saluting your courage basically for writing the book. And I think we do advocacy with ADNA, and Africans Rising. So I want to just quickly, as we wrap this up, and bring Kumba back into the conversation, I want to speak about the Commonwealth meeting that's coming up in Rwanda. There is also an article that just came out by Dave Zirin, a sports writer, about the NBA hosting games for Africa, the Africa Basketball League in Rwanda, criticizing it for how can the shining a light on the atrocities by the government of Rwanda. How can this Commonwealth meeting be used as a way to advocate for change in Rwanda? Or what should members of the Commonwealth, heads of governments know about Rwanda and maybe rethink the idea of even going there?
Well, I think they're going to go there. I hope some of them, most of them will read my book before they go there. I think it's a great opportunity. I mean, they shouldn't have staged it there in the first place. It should never have been chosen as a venue. It was a completely inappropriate choice. But since they're going, let them raise these issues, you know, publicly, vocally, and repeatedly with the Rwandan government and with Paul Kagame himself, instead of doing the polite diplomatic thing. Let them say, you know, we're very impressed by the state of your roads. We're very impressed by your flower beds and the neatness and cleanliness. But we don't like what we're hearing on the human rights front. And, you know, we really think you need to move on that. And I hope they'll do that rather than be, you know, polite and avoid the issue.
Well, thank you so much, Michaela. It's been a great pleasure hosting you here. And I would like to bring in Kumba Toure to give some closing remarks. And just so that those of you in the audience know, afterwards, we'll be available for a short period of time to chit chat.
Thank you so much, Claude and Michaela. I will close as I started, just by thanking you and upholding your work, your courage, and also thanking all the people who came on board today to have this conversation. Our job is not to be polite; it's to raise the issues that are at stake, and that if we don't speak about what happens, if we don't challenge, the injustices that we see, so what is the worth of all the struggle and the sacrifice that people have had before us to bring us to this point? So thank you again for that work. I would like again to thank the Advocacy Network for Africa, AGLAN, that have been pulling together several conversations and being able to work with Africans Rising about putting these stories out there. So thank you again. Friends of the Congo, of course, for all of their work in the Congo and in the whole Great Lake region, and also helping us hearing these stories and pushing us to take action. AGM TV, that is helping us get these stories out, because we need more and more people to hear, to be witnesses, and to speak out, and to ask the questions about what has really happened, and who and where. And of course, Africa Great Lake Action Network, Africans Rising members and supporters also. Thank you for being with us. I cannot go without saying thank you to Emil Woods for all that she's been doing to put all of us together. Please take actions, connect with the people that you can, call your representatives when you can, write about the subject, read about it, teach about it, and do what is in your power to protect the people. Thank you again, Claude, and thank you, Michaela.
Thank you so much.
That will join us again in the next notes from Africa that we will continue to do. This is the first of a series that we are putting together. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.